everyone. Welcome to, Brian and Kristy's studio, not San Diego Comic-Con. Good news, you still get to see the presentation. Good news. Bad. All right, well today we are going to talk about how to color comics. So for those of you that don't know us, I'm Dr. Kristy Miller, and this is Brian Miller, and we own Hi-Fi Color Design. Hi-Fi is a digital coloring studio. That means that we have around 35 employees around the world, and they all do various aspects of digital coloring for us. We are a studio. That means that we all work together, and so if you ever look us up on comics, you'll see us under the name of Hi-Fi or Hi-Fi Design. Hi-Fi has worked for a variety of different people over the years, everything from Superman and Spider-Man to SpongeBob to Star Wars to Buffy the Vampire Slayer. You name it, we've worked on it. So today, what we're going to do is give you a little background on us. Then we're going to take you through the steps of how we do our particular coloring. Now, there are lots of variations out there, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go along. But generally, this is our method. We literally came up with this method in order to streamline our studio. So first off, let me tell you a little bit about Brian. Brian is a traditional colorist, painter originally, acrylics, oils, those kinds of things. He went to school to be a fine artist, and then he discovered Photoshop. And when he discovered Photoshop, he never looked back. Now he tends to do a combination of things, everything from iPad to Canvas to eventually Photoshop. But digital coloring bug hit, and we have been running this studio. I was going to tell you how many years, but let's not talk about that. A while, let's go with. So I am Dr. Kristy Miller. I don't have an art background. I am actually an archaeologist and a college professor. Brian travels the world with me. We currently work on a dig in the country of Oman. And the beauty of digital coloring is you can do it anywhere that there's internet. So Brian and I work abroad part of the year, and I make him do things like draw pottery and make maps, which he's thrilled about. I also have a background in education, and Brian and I have done a variety of these classes for schools, museums, online versions, in-person versions, all kinds of stuff. So we typically give this panel at San Diego Comic-Con every year. So we're pleased to be able to give it to you this year, although it's slightly a different location. So a couple of other things that you should know is that a lot of the art you're going to see is from a variety of places, a variety of artists. I'll try to give shout outs as we go along to the different people. Because I said we've worked in a variety of different parts of the industry. We've done everything from obviously comic books, but movie posters, package design, video games, you name it. And so you're going to see a variety of different things. Also, Brian is an artist in his own right. He works under the name of Octopolis. I'll spell that for you later if you care. But Brian works for places like Star Wars and Fandango and different Disney shoots and different things like that. So a variety of different skills. So you could see some of his art in this as well. All right, so what we're going to do today is we are going to take you all the way through the process and show you some of our tips and tricks, but also give you maybe some pointers you may not know, even if you're really good with Photoshop, and talk a little bit about light and shadow and visual storytelling, which is kind of what we like to emphasize. So the process starts, and again, you may do this a different way. This is just the way we do it, or you might know some different shortcuts or different ways to do things. And then again, your way is probably perfectly fine. We're just going to tell you how we do things in the studio, and we'll tell you the reasons why we do them. So the first part of this is that we will start with our black and white art. We're going to assume you know how to get that. Old school days, you scanned it in. These days, a lot of it's already digital, so a variety of ways to get the art. But our first step is what we call flat color. This is literally like a coloring book. You got to color on all of the little bits and nooks and crannies. So that's step one. The next step is when you get to the fun stuff, which is where you go into what we call the rendering, which is where you add the light and shadow and things. And then the really fun stuff, which are the color holds and the special effects. That's the tings and the glows and the explosions and all that kind of fun stuff. So we'll give you a run through on all of that as we go along today. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of hand back and forth. And so Brian's going to talk to you about the creative process and how we set files up and the different things we do. And then we'll kind of share the story for the rest of the time. All right, Brian, you're up. You finally get to talk.
So good to see everybody in virtual form. Hello, San Diego Comic-Con. So because we have a studio of colorists, we have to make sure that In this example, Superman looks the same on the first panel of the first page as he does on the last panel of the last page. Plus, there's usually 10 to 12 issues per year. To make that happen, that consistency happen, we created a creative process. And what that means is that we do things in a sequential order, and we use that same order for every project that we do. That way, if we need extra help, or if someone's sick, or whatever happens, we can pick up at any time, and we're all working in the same way. So our first step is always the art import. Like Kristy said, that could be scanning. Now some people are working digitally. Some of the pencilers and inkers are working digitally. They might give us a digital file. And if it's not already formatted in the correct resolution and the correct dimensions, we'll fix that. Then we'll do the flat color, the color rendering, color holds if needed. That's optional. That's where we change some of the black lines to colors, and the special effects. And then we always end up by making sure everything's perfect and ready to go to print. But that's our process, and we do that always in that order, and it just makes it easier for us to ensure consistency. The number one question we get about digital coloring is, what sort of tools do pro comic colorists use? And right now in our industry, Adobe Photoshop is the standard. It's other software is coming along, and I'm doing some coloring on the iPad now too, but I always go back to Photoshop to get it ready for print. So if you're wanting to work with a professional publisher, or maybe make your own print comics, Adobe Photoshop's the way to go. And the other thing you need is some sort of input device. That can be anything from like a $59 Wacom tablet that's like a 4x6 inch, which is what I use a lot of the time, and especially if I'm on the road working on a laptop, up to one of the big, beautiful, like 22-inch Cintiqs that you've seen. So you don't have to have the biggest and the best. Luckily, coloring doesn't really take a lot of hardware to do, so any of those Wacom tablets work fine. But that's really it. Some sort of a computer, some version of Photoshop, and an input device like a Wacom tablet. And if you've seen Photoshop before, you may have encountered the layers palette and the channels palette, and I'll be jumping back and forth between those two a lot today, so I find it's easier if I just tell you why I'm doing that. Anytime that you see me in the channels palette, that's for storage. So I might be storing a copy of my line art in there, or I might want to store a copy of my flat colors in there, or maybe a selection or a texture or something else that I want access to later that's not really part of the finished artwork, but is something that I'll need access to. So I'm always using channels for storage. And then when you see me in layers, that's the canvas. That's where I'm painting and coloring and creating the special effects and doing all the things that you'll actually see on the comic page. So as I jump back and forth, that's how I'm using those two features. And with that, I think we can jump into some live coloring and get going here. So let's see.
Dead coloring.
Versus dead coloring, that's right. So let's see what we've got here. So our first step of everything is flat color, like Kristy was saying before. And this is sort of the foundation that we build on. So what I like to do is just take any kind of light color from my swatches. It doesn't have to be any specific color yet. Just any sort of pale light color, and just flood the entire canvas with that color. And so I can do that using the fill command in Photoshop, and that way there's no white pixels on the canvas, because I only want there to be white on there if I put it there, because it can cause some problems later. The next thing I would do is start breaking down the individual panels. And I really like to work from the background forward, so I'll probably break down all three of these panels into solid colors. And I like to do that using the lasso tool, because then I can just select around the edges of the panels and fill them with color. So here we'll just go with another light color, and we can do the same for these other two panels.
I have to be the questions in the audience, so here's one we typically get. Why can't I just use the marquee tool or the pencil tool, Brian?
Well, technically, there's probably some perfect artwork out there where you could use the marquee tool. In my experience, most hand-drawn art, and a lot of even digital art, the panels aren't perfect squares or perfect rectangles. So using the lasso tool ensures that I can go right down the middle of the lines and not have to worry about, having part of the color kind of peek out from the inside. So it really just kind of avoids mistakes that way.
And what about the pencil tool?
The pencil tool can be nice, but one of the problems is that if you're zoomed out of Photoshop, say 100% or less, you could be leaving little specks behind with the pencil tool that you don't see, little areas where you didn't fill with color. So that's another reason that, unless you're a super pro user, I would just stick to the lasso and the fill command. So with SpongeBob here, I'm going to start to fill in some of his colors. And SpongeBob is a well-known animated character, and so he has established colors. So in this instance, I want to make sure that the colors are consistent with the previous issue that we worked on. So I'm going to go to one of those pages from the previous issue and just use the eyedropper to start to sample some of SpongeBob's colors that I can use in my flats. And that way, we'll just have a little bit more consistency from issue to issue and also from page to page.
So you'll notice that when he is using this lasso, he's literally kind of driving down the middle of the line art, right? He's not going to the very edge and he's not going inside of it. It's literally down the center of that line art. And obviously that's easier in some line art than others, but that's just the whole goal. You don't want to try to trace something, you want to go down the middle. And we'll explain why later on. A lot of it has to do with the printing press, and if pages shift over on the press, you'll get this little halo around stuff. That's sometimes where people left white areas or areas that didn't get completely flatted. Another thing is that SpongeBob himself there is very particular. The Simpsons, Adventure Time, all kinds of things that are cartoon-based or even package designs and stuff like that have very specific call-out colors. So your job as the colorist is to know what those are and to make sure you get them right. SpongeBob sends us Pantone colors, so they're very particular about what color SpongeBob is because they want it to be uniform, obviously, so you got to get that right. Other times, as a colorist, your job is, if DC Comics hands you an issue of Superman, you better know what Superman looks like, right? So therefore, your job is to know or find out what those characters are or what their current incarnation is. Now, inevitably, we end up with corrections later on. Inevitably. Always. And so we're going to show you at the very end how you can make some corrections if that happens to come along. For example, if you did Superman and all of a sudden they tell you he's Bizarro Superman or something, there's a way to fix it. But actually, all of this starts with your flats. If you don't get your flats right, then the rest of the process is going to not work as well. So a couple of important things to remember. Number one is that you need to have anti-alias off, right? Unchecked. You do not want the anti-alias on because it'll give you little, what we call artifacts, little doodads almost around the edges, and you will not be able to fix it. Specks, doodads, whatever. You will not be able to fix it. So you have to make sure of that. The other thing is that you want to make sure you do not repeat colors. So like SpongeBob needs to be the exact same yellow on every frame of the page, every panel, and on every page. But you cannot use SpongeBob's yellow in your backgrounds. And again, there's a very specific reason for that, which we'll tell you about later. We'll show you how that works. But for now, you can see Brian's kind of whizzing along here. This is not really his job. We have other people that do the flatting for us. But he's going to show you a little trick here that'll save you some time. And then I'll come back and tell you a little bit more about flatting.
Oh, sure. I can show you that trick. Let me just back this up a step or two. And we'll do that. So I made a lasso selection. I'm going to zoom in, hopefully that it shows on the video. I want to fill in the pants on SpongeBob brown, but I've already flatted in the shirt white, and the behind this panel is already green. So I don't have to remake either of those selections again. What I can do is I can take the magic wand tool, and when I hold down the option key, it turns the symbol from the magic wand to the negative wand. And that allows me to subtract from my selection. So if I click now on the shirt, it will subtract the shirt away. If I click on this gutter color, it'll subtract that away, leaving just a perfect selection of the pants that I can then fill with the brown color. And the reason that's important is underneath of the line art, we want the colors to match, to have a perfect seam. And so if we turn that off, we can see the brown of the pants and the white of the shirt have this like perfect seam. There's no specks or gaps or anything like that, and they both fall underneath the line art. And so that's the best reason to use that negative magic wand trick, because you'll end up not having those gaps and specks. And like Kristy said, later on in the printing process, any of those kind of things can start to cause problems.
Another little thing, when you're doing that, so the pointer is that he can take his lasso and go really wildly through the part that he's not doing. For example, the yellow on the sponge or the white on the shirt, and then come back and like get the tie, for example. So it doesn't work when you have yellow on yellow, but it's when there's two different colors. And it's a super fast way to do this. Remember, I like to always say time is money. I'm in charge of the clients and the employees and the business side of Hi-Fi, and so time is money. And so if you can speed up your process and still make it really good, that's always a bonus. And this is one of those ways to speed up your process. There's several other little tips on how to do things too, but that's like one of the biggest ones. Flatting is its entire own career. We have people that's what they do for a living is flats, and they work for a variety of different people, not just us. And it's for people that are working their way into the rendering, or for people that are really good at Photoshop but not necessarily good at like the artistic side of seeing the light and the shadow and all that kind of stuff. As a matter of fact, my mother works for us. I like to joke that if my mother can do it, anybody can. Sorry, Mom. But it is a way that as long as you understand the Photoshop parts of it and you can follow along with the reference, you're pretty good to go. So flatting, as we said, is the basis. It's the important part. You need to really get this right. Do not repeat your colors in the background that you use on your characters. Do not use 100% white and do not use 100% black for anything. Not eyeballs, not teeth, not anything. You give them a little bit of a color. We're going to have to move on, but Brian's going to show you what the finished page looks like, and this is just like a super simple, quick version of flatting.
So we can see that here's the original flats for that page. So this is how the flat colors looked when it was all done. And then here's the rendered colors with all the detail and the shading added, which on SpongeBob means mostly the backgrounds, right? They're like painted backgrounds and the characters are more simple. But that just gives you a little idea of the difference between the flats and the finished page. So once we have the flats done, then we're ready to move on to some rendering. And rendering is where we add all the highlights and the shadows and all the detail. So here we have this Booster Gold illustration. This is by Dan Jurgens and Norm Ratman. And once again, we can see here's the flat colors. So this is what they look like. And then I've started working on this, and I've got pretty much everything done except for Booster Gold's chest, his face, and his hair. So we can start to look at some of that right now. Let's start, we'll maybe do with the chest first as like a warm-up.
Why don't you tell them about the process?
And so the way we do that is we use the magic wand to click on our flat color for the chest, and then we use the layer via copy command in Photoshop to move that selection onto its own layer. And now's the part that maybe some people will get a little lost, because what we'll see sometimes is like if I take this paintbrush and I'm going to put it to like a really obnoxious color so that you can see it really well. If I wanted to start rendering on his chest and I start painting, well, that paint's going everywhere. So the thing we have to do is we have to turn on the preserve transparency lock on that layer, and that will allow us to paint anywhere we want on the canvas, but the paint will only go onto his chest. So that's one of those little hi-fi tricks that is really helpful. The other one that we do a lot is to paint with light. Oops, let me undo that, guys. There we go. So what we'll see oftentimes is people will see like this gold area, and they might look at it and then think to themselves, okay, it's gold, so I need to add in, like, I'm going to put in some dark shadow underneath his chest, and I'm going to put some shadow over here, and maybe some shadow here, and then they'll go and they'll get a different color from their palette, and they'll start trying to paint in some highlights and all that. So that could work. If it was your own project and you're doing it one time, that could work. But again, we're doing 20 or 22 pages per issue, and 10 to 12 issues per year. That would be a lot of colors to keep track of. So we're going to go with a different approach. So we'll just throw that layer away and we'll start over. So we're going to select it and layer via copy and preserve transparency.
Where does layer via copy live, Brian?
So layer via copy is one of the commands in Photoshop, and you can get to that through the layer menu, which is layer new, layer via copy, or you can use the keyboard shortcut. So if you want to color, that's a good trick to know. So what we're going to do instead of painting with that normal mode and all those different colors is we're going to switch our paintbrush from normal to screen. And in Photoshop, what screen mode is painting with light. So instead of having to keep track of a bunch of values, we really now only have to keep track of our flat color value and our what we call our screen color or screen tone. And that's what we're going to use to paint with light. And before I get started, I'll just give you an example of that. So before we were painting with value, we just get one value. But with light, if I start to put some highlight down on the shoulder, every time I put my brush down, it's going to get brighter and brighter and brighter. So that's the difference when you're painting with light, is I only need that one value, but I can create all my different shades with that.
Super secret trick there.
It is a super secret trick. And it's usually about this point that someone asks, why don't you just use dodge and burn? So the answer to that is that dodge and burn can create colors that can't be printed. So that could be colors that are too bright and saturated that can't be printed on paper, or colors that are too dark and saturated that go beyond the darkness of what we're allowed to print. So that's the reason that you won't see very many professional colorists using dodge and burn. All right, so we've got our brush set to screen mode. We've got our area on its own layer with preserved transparency, and we're ready to start adding some details. And the way I like to do that is to use the lasso tool to select some of the areas where I want to add some highlight, and then I'll use the brush tool to go in and create those highlights. And with the lasso tool, I'm just thinking about where I want the highlights to be. I'm controlling where those highlights are going to go. And because it's metal, I'm going to probably go pretty high contrast and try to get some nice shine going on the gold metal areas. And so I'll just keep doing that, and we'll build this up a little bit, just one step at a time.
So a couple of things to keep in mind. Typically, when you start rendering, you will do that magic wand thing where you pop the color that you're working on. You'll do all of them. So Brian will do all, I almost called him Booster. Brian will do all of Booster Gold's yellows or golds at the same time. He might do all of Booster's skin at the same time on the entire page. And so that way you become consistent and you get used to that particular color and the flow of that. Then he'll go back. So we don't actually paint all the way through. If you notice, he's not in the blues right now. He's not in the ribs, whatever that is, a neck of Booster. He's just doing the gold, right? And so that's actually another one of those things people don't realize. You don't paint all the way through the character. You do it in sections. And so this is part of the reason that your flats matter, right? If I want to just get Booster's gold color as my flatter, I only want you to use that particular color on Booster's gold parts. So if I have like a tree in the background or some building or whatever, that's going to slow me down and mess me up, right? So that's part of the reason why your flats matter so much. Another thing that matters is this is the time when you have to use your left and right brain. You have to understand the Photoshop tools, but you also have to understand the light and shadow, and you have to understand what the artist is trying to tell you. Dan Jurgens is obviously a great artist, and so he knows what he wants it to look like, and then Brian can see based on the way that Dan has drawn in the thicker lines versus the thin lines, or perhaps he put in a little shadow somewhere, and that tells Brian where to add the light and shadow, right? That's your job as the colorist to make sure that works. The other thing is a lot of times you don't think about it, but this is a white background with nothing in it, but a lot of times you get the script as the colorist and it'll say it's nighttime. Well, there's nothing drawn there, right? You have to make it nighttime. Or it's high noon. Well, what does high noon look like? You have to figure that out as the colorist. So you have a lot of other jobs in there other than just how do I make Photoshop do what I want. So Brian is tooling along here on the golds. He might have done this a couple of times or two, so he can do this kind of quickly. He also happens to be a Booster Gold fan, so there's that.
And a Dan Jurgens fan, too.
And Norm. But the other thing that you need to notice as you watch him is that how he uses the lasso and how he uses the brush. Now, when he makes a selection, he is envisioning where he wants the light, the screen to go, right? Where does the brush go? And then if you'll watch him what he does in the brush, the bracket keys, by the way, make your brush smaller and bigger as you go. So on the fly, you can change the size of your brush. Well, he's continually doing that, and he uses the edge of the brush a lot of times so that it gives him a different texture, and Photoshop automatically kind of blends that in. If you just use your brush and fill in the whole part of what you've lassoed, you might as well just flat it, right? You've just essentially filled the whole thing with color, and that's not what he's doing. So as he goes here, we'll see if we can get him to leave the marching ants up long enough for you to be able to see this. Brian is obviously does this for a living, so he always turns off the ants and he goes really fast.
I can do that on the face.
So we'll try to get him to slow down a little bit so you can see the selection of the lasso, because it's kind of important to start thinking about where do I put that lasso in order to make things look like they're supposed to.
All right, so I can move on to the face and you can remind me to do that. Okay, so just a kind of a quickie version of like how the gold metallics could look on his chest there.
So show the before.
So the before is just the flat, and then we did all the shading and the rendering there. So you know it works out pretty quick, and it's a really nice technique to get us where we want to go. So with Booster's face, you know, he's wearing these goggles, so we can't see part of his face, but we can see that. Dan and Norm have put some shadow in there a couple places, and that will sort of indicate to us how we want to do the lighting on the face. So again, I'm just going to use the lasso tool to think about, where some of the highlights are and where some of the shadows might be, and just start to make a rough selection on the face. And I'm just looking at what the artist has provided me as the guidelines, and just thinking about what they might want.
And it's a large selection. See how big he has that? It's over almost his whole face.
And I can go, my marching ants go outside of the skin into this blue area and into the goggles, because remember, all I'm really working on is what's on this layer, is the skin. So it doesn't matter if I paint outside or draw outside of that, because I'm not going to affect anything else. All right, so what I like to do for the face is I like to start at the eyeball and just kind of drag the brush down towards the chin from each eye, and that makes sort of like a V shape, and that's going to ensure that my highlight along the cheeks is in the right place.
You end up with
because otherwise, if you try to bring the light all the way out to the side of the face, you can end up with this, like, they've got their mouth full chipmunk cheek look. So if you just go from the pupil down towards the chin, you'll always have the highlight in the right spot. And then I'll add a little bit into the nose, and maybe I can hit just the top of the chin and the top of the lip a little bit. And this would sort of be like my first pass on the face before I start adding some details. So something like that. If we zoom out, you can see that. And so there's where we were. And so that's just the first pass. And from there, we can just start to add some details. So,
which is another thing that people don't realize, is that this is multiple times that he'll do this. And when it's something really shiny or something very detailed, you can make enough of these cuts, like 7, 8 times you'll have to go in and do this. It's not just a one and done kind of thing, especially depending on your style and what you're doing. The other thing is that if you'll notice, the bit under his nose and I'm talking about Booster, not Brian. The bit underneath the nose and the chin, the lip right there, that is his flat color, right? He didn't change it at all. So again, flatter, it's important that you get the flat colors right. You use that reference so that Brian doesn't have to change that. And he's not touching it with anything. It's the flat color, right? So that's the darkness that's in that particular area. So then if he goes along, he makes a set of cuts, and then he uses his brush. And then he does it again, and he does it again, right? So you continually build it up, so to speak, so that it becomes more clear, the shape of the face, where the shadow is on it, and he's still only just using that one same color in screen mode and his brush, and controlling it with the lasso. That's it. Super easy, sort of. Okay, he makes it look a lot easier than it is, but you get the idea.
Right. And so I could do some more detail on the face.
Did you do the nose?
Yeah, but this one's behind the goggles, so it doesn't really have...
But do it anyway.
Okay. So what we normally do...
This is my favorite part.
At hi-fi, so this is behind the goggles, so we can't see it, but what we would normally do is a selection like this for the nose.
Which looks like an...
It sort of looks like an exclamation point.
Yay!
And so that will give us the ridge of the nose, and then like the bulb, the tip of the nose. And so if we could see all of his nose, that's one of those like little hi-fi things that we tend to do just about all the time.
And Brian saw that in Renaissance paintings. If you go back and look at original oil paintings, like in a museum somewhere, you'll see that that's what they did too. And so it actually works really well. But if you get really close and you look in, you'll see little exclamation points on people's noses.
All right, so if we're happy with the face, we can move on to the hair. And, the important thing with hair is, for the most part, we don't try to render individual strands of hair. We're more concerned with the shape of the head and how the hair sits on the form of the head. So you've probably seen that sort of like the comic book or cartoon style of hair rendering, maybe on some like anime cartoons or in some comic books, but we sort of have our own style that colorists and comic books have adopted for hair. And so again, I'm just really more interested in the shape or the form of the head than trying to create strands of hair. So again, I'm just going to take the lasso, make a rough selection for my first pass, and then I'll just take the brush tool. And like Kristy said, I can use the bracket keys to make that brush bigger or smaller as I paint. And I'm just trying to show the roundness of his head, first and foremost, before I worry about anything else. Just getting some of that roundness in there, so that when we zoom out, we get that sort of where the hair sits on the head, which is more important than those individual strands.
And if you look out, I almost said into the audience, Well, if you were in an audience and you looked out and you see from far away, you don't see people's individual strands of their hair anyway, right? You see kind of the shape and the form. It's only when you get super close do you see that, and so that's kind of the same idea. There are a few examples out there where you will see they'll paint particular strands, and there's actually a good tip on that we won't get to today, but you can actually make a brush that is hair, and then the brush will do a lot of that work for you. And so you put one stroke down and the brush does like several strokes at the same time, and if you get it to look right, then it looks like strands of hair. It's super cool. You can play with the brushes settings in Photoshop.
Right, and what you would want to look for is something called a rake brush. So that's the kind of brush in Photoshop that would give you like a nice fur or hair texture.
Fur.
So, because you could use it for people's hair, and you could use it for animals or creatures and stuff like that too. So let's see. So I think something like that would be just like a basic approach to doing booster gold. So we did some metallic golds, we did some skin, and we did some hair. And again, it's all just using the lasso and the brush tool, or the lasso and the gradient tool, that combination, to get that really pop rendering that we like to see. Now that was a quickie version. We can see what, if we took a little bit more time and added in the effects and stuff, this is sort of how the final version was that I colored for the trade paperback.
Yay! Okay, let's do the fun stuff.
Okay, so now if all of our rendering is done and we're happy, we get to move on to special effects.
Special effects are literally the booms, the kapows, the explosions, the fun stuff. Also in special effects, kind of goes hands in hands, is color holds, or sometimes called knockouts. We're not really going to talk about them today. They work essentially the same way as flatting, and what you're doing is changing the line art to a color. And there is a quick and easy way to do it. It literally is like flatting, except for you're changing the line color. And you do this for a variety of reasons, like the goggles on Booster Gold you might have noticed, or smoke, things that make it more believable in its environment.
Yeah, here's an example.
So there you go.
You can see on Booster Gold's goggles, the black lines, we changed those to like a dark gold, and so that would be an example of color holds.
And you can do it for a variety of things. And if you watch like the cartoons or something like that, start paying attention to what they color hold. For example, The Simpsons, their bodies are not color held, but if you watch SpongeBob, his body, sponge, is color held. So start paying attention to those differences. It's just kind of like a stylistic thing.
So what we have here is, this is from Justice League 3001, and this is a cool illustration by Howard Porter of Batman and this like Batbot thing. And so we've already done all the rendering, and we can see like this looks pretty good as is. We could send this to press and everybody would probably be pretty happy. But looking at the artwork without the color, we can see that the artist has implied a few things here that we want to pay attention to. So the artist has drawn this lightning in the background and this stormy sky. So that tells us, one, we should probably paint some lightning in there. And B, if there's a stormy sky, there might be rain. So it might be fun to add some rain to this. Also in the backgrounds, we've got some buildings where there's some windows we might want to illuminate, and some of the other things we might want to add some glows and sparkles and stuff too.
By the way, artists out there, don't draw the rain. Don't draw the snow. Trust us. We can do it better and faster. No pressure.
It's new school.
Yeah. If you draw in all that rain or all that snow, we have to go back and take that color hold and go around every individual piece of snow and rain you did, whereas we can just make it on our own. So it's one of those little
things. A creative choice.
Yeah.
All right, so in rendering, we showed you how we could use screen mode to paint with light while we're doing the rendering. One of the cool things in Photoshop is we can also use screen mode on layers. So we like to do all of our special effects on its own layer, and our layer is set to screen mode. And what that allows us to do is paint light effects onto the image, but they all live on that layer. So the lighting is passed down to all layers below it, but it's not permanent, so it doesn't change or alter permanently anything that we've already done. So we've got our special effects layer, and I think the first thing I want to do is add a little bit of atmosphere between Batman and this kind of like bat robot behind him. So I'm going to do that by making a selection. I'm going to use my flats to make a quick selection, but normally I would probably take my lasso and very carefully trace around Batman, but you guys don't want to watch me do that today. So I'm going to make just a quick selection here. And I'm just going to grab my gradient tool, and maybe I'll just sample with the eyedropper some of this teal color from the background and just try to gradient a little bit of that into that selection on the special effects layer. And you can see that pretty rapidly that's going to make that Batman character pop forward and create some space and depth between the two of them.
Atmospheric perspective.
Then I think I'm going to grab the paintbrush and some blue, and there's some little spots on this bat robot that look like they're supposed to be like little lights or little things that are glowing. So I'm going to just take the brush tool and just add some glows to those, just so it gives it a little bit of illumination. And the nice thing about the special effects layer is it allows us to add glows over top of the black line art. But again, it's not permanent, so we can always go back and we can make changes, or change the color of the glow or anything if we want to later. So
that's another thing that people usually ask us, is that how come we put the line art in a channel instead of putting it in a layer? And the answer is because in a channel you can't screw it up. If you keep it in a channel, it is isolated and protected. If you put the line art in a layer, you could accidentally merge in your color, you could accidentally change or alter that original art, which sometimes artists don't want you to do, right? So we keep it in a channel, and then it's safe and protected and you can't mess it up. And then you can still see it, but then you won't accidentally merge or make a mistake or anything. So that's why we use the channels instead of the layer for the actual line art.
Right, and so when we get to the special effects phase, we create a temporary line art layer underneath the special effects just so we can see it, but at the very end we get rid of that. All right, so we've added the glows to the bat bot and to the little lights in the background of the city. So I think it's time that we add in some lightning. Now, I showed you before where the artist had drawn the lightning. So I went ahead and I made a selection of that, and I saved it into a channel. And so I can use the make a selection from the channel. There's a little button on the channel palette there. And so now what I can do is I could just fill this with just pure, like maybe like a pale white teal kind of color for our lightning. So let's make that real quick.
You kind of sound like Bob Ross just then.
I get a little Bob Rossi when I'm thinking. So, okay, that looks like lightning, but it's not really glowing, right? So what we want to do is we want to modify that selection that we have. And so we can go to Select, Modify, and expand the selection. So let's expand it out. Let's go like 18 pixels today. And then we can feather the selection. So again, Select, Modify, and we'll choose Feather. And maybe we'll do 24 pixels on the feather. And so that's made that selection of lightning grow and soften. And so now if we take our color and we take our paintbrush and we start to brush into that selection, we're going to get this really nice glow.
Now it looks like lightning.
And that's going to give us that lightning look that we're going for. It kind of comes down in the bottom of the page a little bit too. So you can see what a difference it makes just by having that softer glowed edge there.
Can we make it rain?
Yeah. So once we have the lightning in, then we're ready to do some rain. I'm going to go make my same color but just a little bit lighter. And one of the brushes, I like to make a lot of brushes, so I've got a couple over here that I've made that are rain brushes. So let's try Rain 2 today. Now if you look at the brush on the screen, I'm going to zoom in on this black area so you can see. That's all the brush is that one stroke. But I've changed my brush settings. So if we look at the preview, I've messed with the spacing and the scattering so that with that one brush tip is going to make a bunch of rain. So as I do one stroke, this is one stroke, it made all that rain. So there's stroke number 2. And I can make the brush a little smaller and do it again. And so now I've got a bunch of rain with just a couple of brush strokes. And that looks pretty cool. Now if it's raining, then that rain is going to make some like splatters on the characters. So I've got this brush that I made called Rain, Snow, and Sand. And I can take that and just start to paint in a little bit of splatter anywhere that rain might be hitting the character. So do that real quick.
And then we need to make a sparkle.
Yeah, we'll show you guys how to do that in just a second too, because Kristy loves the sparkles and the magic. All right, so just a couple more of these little rain splatters, and that's going to really help the environment that the characters are in seem more believable. If it's raining on them, then that rain would be splashing off of them in a few places.
All right, so have you ever seen those old Orbitz commercials for the gum? And so she would always do that ting, off her teeth. Well, you can use the lens flare in Photoshop, but that's boring because everybody does that and everybody can tell. But you can make your own super easy. So Brian's going to make a ting off of Batman's teeth because it's awesome.
All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make another screen layer. So I just made a new layer and set it to screen. And that way I can modify this as I go along. You could paint directly on the special effects, but I want to be able to have some freedom to change this. So I'm just going to take my paintbrush. Let me zoom way in here so you can see it. Take my paintbrush, And I'm going to start by just kind of making a little, like a squiggle to make a little spot on the canvas. So I'm just kind of swirling my brush around there. And every time I touch, it's getting a little bit brighter. So that's just a basic glow. And then I can take my lasso tool and I can make like the shape of an X with some like points on the end. So something like that. There's my selection. And I'll go back to my paintbrush, and again, I'll use the bracket key to make it really big. So somewhere in there. And I'm just doing some little circular motions with the brush, and I'll make it a little bit smaller. There we go. And when I hide those marching ants, we've got ourselves a pretty nice looking sparkle right there.
Yay!
Right off of Batman's teeth.
Okay, if you don't like the teeth, fine.
So yeah, if we didn't really want it on the teeth, because I made it on its own layer, we could move that and do whatever we want with it. So maybe we want it to be on the robot's eye.
Not nearly as fun.
I might want to rotate that a little bit, just change the size and the scale of it. And if I was happy with it, get it just where I want it there, I could actually use the layer via copy command again to duplicate it and then double it up so it's coming on both of the eyes there.
All right. Maybe it's better than the teeth, whatever.
It might be a little over the top. We may not send it to print like this.
I don't know why not.
It's an extreme example of what you could do with Photoshop.
All right, so speaking of changes, inevitably the editor calls you at the 11th hour and says, oh, by the way, this looks great, but that's the wrong Batman. Instead, we have decided that this is going to be the Batman that is the...
Breast cancer awareness Batman?
Okay, so we're going to have to change his colors. Well, you think, oh, now I have to redo everything I've done. Well, you actually don't. Because you did your flats right, you can actually fix this pretty quickly.
So I'm going to turn off the special effects layer so we can see what we're doing, and we can go back to our background layer where our flats are, and I'm just going to select the different red areas on Batman so that we can change those colors. And then I'll go back to the render layer, and I'm going to use the hue saturation in Photoshop to change the color. And so I can adjust the sliders to be any, nope, there it goes, any color I want. So there's yellow, there's green, there's blue and pink.
Pink.
So you get the idea that we can adjust it to be anything we want it to be.
And it doesn't change your rendering, right?
It doesn't change the rendering.
Which is the beauty of this. Now, if the editors ask, this takes like days. It's really hard. But in reality, we can do it semi-quickly as long as it's not like, let's now go from this dark and stormy night to a bright sunshiny day. That does take a while. But if you just need to change a costume, it's pretty quick and simple.
Yeah, so that's a quick way you can make changes. And again, you wouldn't be able to do that if you didn't already have your flats. So that's just a quick example of how we do flatting and rendering in special effects. And because we're not live, you can't ask us questions.
That might be good. So we decided to give you a couple of resources in case you did want to ask a question later on. First of all, some of you may already know that Brian and I wrote this book called Hi-Fi Color for Comics. It's available on Amazon and Comixology if you are interested. Everything we talked about today is in there and a lot more. It comes with homework assignments because I am a college professor, and it has things like all the art that you'll need, brushes, textures, all kinds of fun stuff. If you're interested, there it is.
And we're also teaching some online courses with the Joe Kubert School right now.
That's right. We've done a couple of summer online classes for them as well. Also, I decided that in case you did have a question you can't actually ask us right now, we pop up our Facebook group. Brian and I don't actually own it, it's fan run, but we do come on and answer people, or other people in the group will answer you too. So if you have a question about something that happened today or that you didn't quite get or understand, feel free to go to the Hi-Fi, what's it called?
Hi-Fi Color for Comics Facebook group.
Well, that's pretty easy. And then, so you can just search for that and then just post up your question. And if we don't answer it, somebody else will, and then eventually we'll get to. So we hope you've enjoyed today's presentation. It was kind of odd doing it this way instead of having the live audience, but we hope that you learned something and that you enjoyed yourself, and hopefully we'll see you next year at San Diego Comic-Con.